He finally smiled at her, and it cost her everything. It was a real smile, not the tight, impatient line his mouth usually was. It happened the moment she told him the baby was gone. For that one fleeting second, his eyes softened. His hand reached out and squeezed hers, and she felt a warmth she hadn't felt in 2 years. Then, the reality of what she had done to earn that smile crashed down on her. Colder than the bathwater she had just held her son under. She had paid for his approval with the small, still body now wrapped in a towel in the next room. The price was absolute, and the silence that followed his smile was already filling with a scream that would live inside her forever. Every beat of her heart now echoed with a single horrifying question. What happens when he stops smiling again? The transaction was complete, but she was the one who had been hollowed out, left with nothing but the ghost of a child and the love of a monster. "It's him or me," Mark said, his voice dangerously calm. "That thing is not my child." And in that moment, with those words, 2-year-old Liam ceased to be her son in her mind. He became an it, an obstacle, the only thing standing between her and the man she couldn't live without. Her love for the boy, once an all-consuming force, was suddenly a distant memory, silenced by the roaring need to prove her loyalty. Her hands, which had once soothed his fevers and tucked him in, became instruments of that proof. As her fingers tightened, there was no maternal instinct, no last-minute reprieve, only the grim resolution of a soldier following a command. It was a swift, terrible erasure. When it was over, she looked at Mark, her eyes begging for validation. She had chosen. She had dismantled her own soul to show him that Liam was never truly hers to begin with. The emptiness where her child used to be was now filled with a terrifying new identity, the woman who belonged wholly to him. She approached him not with grief, but with a terrible, expectant pride. "I did it," she whispered, her voice raw. "For us." She laid the burden of her act at his feet like a gruesome gift, the ultimate offering to the god of their fractured relationship. She had sacrificed her firstborn on the altar of his discontent, believing this final, unthinkable act would cement them together forever. In the stark silence that followed her confession, she searched his face for the relief, the gratitude, the love she had purchased with her son's life. But his eyes held only a slow dawning horror, a flicker of fear, of her. The offering, she realized too late, was tainted. It was not a sacred thing that would bless their union, but a curse that would forever poison the space between them. She had given him everything, and in doing so had revealed a monster he never knew lived beside him. The bond she sought to create was now a chain of shared guilt, and its weight was already pulling them under. The last cry was silenced, and the house was finally, perfectly quiet. For David, this was the moment he had been waiting for. The constant grating noise of the toddler, the whining, the pointless babbling, the clatter of toys was gone. The visual clutter of high chairs and brightly colored plastic was next to go. He could already picture the clean, minimalist lines of the living room, a serene adult space where he could think, where he could relax, where he and Sarah could be a real couple without that demanding, sticky-fingered obstacle always between them. He hadn't explicitly said the words, "Drown him in the bath." He was more refined than that. He'd painted the picture of their perfect future, a future where it was just the two of them. And then he'd carefully, methodically, pointed out how the child was the single, glaring flaw in that picture. He had hollowed Sarah out with sighs of disappointment and pointed comments about other, less complicated women, until she was an empty vessel, waiting to be filled with his will. Now, as she emerged from the bathroom, her face a mask of shock, he felt a surge of pure satisfaction. It was done. His perfect world was within reach. He pulled her into an embrace, not to comfort her, but to claim his prize. "You did the right thing, Sarah," he murmured into her hair. "For us." But as he held her, he felt the violent tremors racking her body, a frantic, unstable energy that threatened to shatter the very peace he had just won. A new thought, cold and unwelcome, crept into his mind. In her desperate act to preserve their relationship, she had introduced a new, unpredictable variable. She was broken now, a piece of his perfect world that was already cracked. How long, he wondered, before that crack spread and ruined everything? The silence he had so coveted was now filled with the deafening sound of her unspoken trauma, and he realized he might have traded one kind of noise for another, far more dangerous one. He had asked her once, during a bitter argument about the baby, "What wouldn't you do for me?" How far would you really go to prove this isn't just some convenient arrangement? The question had hung in the air, a toxic challenge. And now she had her answer. The proof was not in whispered sweet nothings or passionate nights, but in the cold, still water of the bathtub. It was written in the final tiny bubbles that escaped her son's lips. This was the ultimate test, and she had passed. She had chosen him over her own flesh and blood, a decision so monstrous it could only be born of a love equally powerful. As she stood trembling before him, waiting for his judgment, she felt a bizarre, terrifying sense of triumph cutting through the horror. She had done the one thing no other woman would ever do. She had loved him beyond reason, beyond morality, beyond instinct. She had given him a piece of her soul, and in return, he would have to be hers forever. Their bond was now sealed in a way that could never be broken. But when she looked into his eyes, she didn't see the awestruck gratitude she expected. She saw a flicker of something else, fascination, yes, but also a dawning calculation. He was seeing her not as his devoted lover, but as a tool of unimaginable power and pliability. If she could do this, what else was she capable of? The proof she had offered was not of her devotion, but of her absolute, terrifying vulnerability to his influence. He now held a secret that could destroy her, and in proving her love, she had made herself his permanent prisoner. The blood that sealed their pact was now a chain, and he held the end of it. It didn't happen all at once. The mother she was, the one who knew the unique weight of her son's head on her shoulder, the scent of his hair after a bath, the sound of his laughter. That woman had been systematically erased. It was a slow, meticulous process, a psychological hollowing performed by the man who claimed to love her. First, it was the complaints.
"He's so loud, Sarah. Can't you make him be quiet?"
Then the isolation. "Your friends don't understand us. They're just jealous." Then the rewriting of history. "You were so much more fun before you got stuck with him. You've lost yourself." He chipped away at her identity, separating Sarah the mother from Sarah the woman until they were at war within her. He made her feel that every moment spent caring for her child was a moment stolen from him, a personal betrayal. By the time he first uttered the words, "Our lives would be so perfect if it was just us," the idea had already taken root. It felt like a solution, not a sin. When her hands finally held her son under the water, it wasn't a moment of rage or passion. It was the final logical step in a long campaign of eradication. The last vestige of her old self, the maternal self, was being destroyed. There was no internal struggle, no last-minute fight. The part of her that would have fought was already gone, replaced by a desperate void that only his approval could fill. As the life left her son's body, so too did the last ghost of the woman she used to be. What was left was a hollow shell, perfectly shaped to his specifications. She had become exactly what he wanted, a creature of his making, capable of anything for a crumb of his affection. And in the profound emptiness that followed, she realized with a chilling clarity that the hollowing was complete. There was nothing left of her to feel the horror. The argument had been about the noise. Always the noise. "I just need 1 hour of quiet, Sarah. 1 single goddamn hour. Is that too much to ask?" Mark had hissed, his voice a taut wire of tension, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. The toddler, sensing the storm in the air, had chosen that moment to begin a fresh, piercing wail from his high chair, banging a sippy cup in a frantic, discordant rhythm. Mark's eyes had snapped shut, a long, suffering sigh escaping him. That sigh was a verdict. It said, "You are failing him, and you are failing me." The pressure, built over months of such sighs and sidelong glances, reached a critical mass inside her. It wasn't a sudden explosive rage, but a chilling, decisive clarity. The path to peace, to his approval, was suddenly terribly clear. She carried the crying child to the bathroom, her movements unnervingly calm. She started the water, the roar of the tap filling the small room. As she lowered him in, his cries escalated, then turned to confused gurgles, and then, with a finality that stole the air from the room, they stopped. The quiet was absolute. It was the quiet he had requested. She had delivered it. She sat on the cold tile, listening to the profound silence, a silence so deep it seemed to have a physical weight, pressing in on her eardrums. She had given him his hour. She had solved the problem. But as the minutes stretched on, the silence began to change. It was no longer a simple absence of sound. It became a presence. It was the silence of a breath that would never be drawn again, of a laugh that would never echo in the hall. It was a hungry silence, and she knew, with a dread that started as a pinprick in her soul and began to spread, that it would never be filled. This was not a temporary peace. It was a permanent void, and when she would have to walk out and tell him, "It's quiet now," she understood that the silence she had created would now live inside her, a screaming void that only she could hear forever. In the days that followed, they became caretakers of a shared terrible secret. They told the story they had rehearsed, a tragic slip in the bath, a moment of turned backs, and the world offered them a tapestry of sympathy and condolences. But within the walls of their home, the truth was a third occupant, a ghost that sat with them at the dinner table and lay between them in bed. It was most palpable in their silences. Before, their quiet moments had been filled with the ambient sounds of a living child. Now they were filled with the echo of the one they had killed. Mark would reach for her hand and she would flinch, her mind flashing to the memory of those same hands, so much smaller and more trusting, going still beneath her own. He tried to resume their life, talking about work, about the news, but every ordinary sentence felt like an obscene performance over a fresh grave. The ghost was in the way he looked at her now, not with love or even with gratitude, but with a wary, calculating horror. He saw what she was capable of, and while it had served his purpose, it also terrified him. She in turn saw the relief he tried to hide, the way he almost seemed lighter without the burden of a child he never wanted. This repulsed her, but it also bound her to him more tightly than love ever could. They were partners in a crime, cellmates in a prison of their own making. They could not speak of their ghost, for to name it would be to unleash its full damning power, yet they could speak of nothing else. Every conversation was a minefield of avoided topics and unspoken words. The love they had supposedly saved was now a rotten thing, and the ghost of the child was the only thing holding it together. A spectral glue made of guilt and shared damnation. Their relationship was a haunted house, and they were the only two people who could see the apparition that was tearing it apart. Brick by brick, Sarah had come to understand her purpose. She was a container for Mark's affection. Her own thoughts, desires, and instincts were irrelevant, mere static that interfered with her primary function, to receive and hold his love. The child, her son from a previous relationship, was a flaw in the vessel. He was a crack through which her old life, her old self, could leak out, threatening the purity of what she was meant to be for Mark. The baby's needs were a constant, draining demand, pulling resources of time, attention, and energy that rightfully belonged to him. Mark never said this outright, but he calibrated his affection with the precision of a manipulative scientist. A peaceful day without toddler tantrums earned her a warm kiss. A night interrupted by crying resulted in a cold shoulder. She learned the metrics. She learned that her value was inversely proportional to the needs of her child. The final lesson was the most brutal. It came after a particularly difficult day, when Mark had stared at the boy with such pure, undiluted contempt that the air in the room had gone cold. "I just don't think I can do this forever," he had said, his voice flat. "I thought I could, but he's always there." In that moment, Sarah saw the choice with terrifying clarity. To remain a vessel for Mark's love, she had to be empty. She had to be clean. The child was a contamination. What followed was not an act of murder in her mind, but an act of purification. It was the necessary, if tragic, maintenance of her only reason for being. She was scouring the vessel, making it whole and acceptable once more. When it was over, she felt a profound, eerie calm. The crack had been sealed. The leak had been stopped. She was empty, yes, but she was now a perfect vacant container, ready to be filled solely by him. She presented herself to him, awaiting the fulfillment of her purpose, the love that was her reward for achieving perfection. She did not expect the horror in his eyes, the hesitation in his touch. He had wanted the vessel empty, but he was now repulsed by the hollow echo he found inside. He had desired a clean slate, but he had not anticipated the sheer, chilling nothingness he had created. The transaction was complete. The price had been paid in full, in the only currency weighty enough to secure him forever. As Sarah stood over the bathtub, watching the last ripples still on the water's surface, she conducted a cold internal audit. The cost: one child, one future, one soul. The gain: Mark. It was a simple if horrific equation. She had weighed the screaming vital need of her son against the sullen, intoxicating pull of her boyfriend, and the boyfriend had won. This was not a moment of passion. It was a brutal calculation. She had added up all the sleepless nights, the financial strain, the way the child's presence narrowed their world, and placed it on one side of the scale. On the other, she placed Mark's smile, his approval, the way he made her feel chosen. The scale had tipped decisively. She had chosen the man over the boy, convinced that the value of the former infinitely outweighed the liability of the latter. She had liquidated her motherhood to finance this relationship. In the immediate aftermath, as she told him what she had done, she felt a grim sense of solvency. The debt was cleared. The obstacle was removed. She had finally paid the entrance fee to their perfect, child-free life. But as the hours turned into days, she began to understand the true nature of her purchase. The cost was not a one-time payment. It was a perpetual draining tax on her every moment. The silence she had bought was filled with the phantom cries of her son. The space she had cleared was now a gaping chasm. Mark was hers, yes, but the cost of keeping him was a constant, gnawing awareness of what was missing. She had traded a living, breathing love for a possessive, hollow one. She owned him now. But the property was haunted, and the ghost was a permanent resident who demanded payment in memories and regret. The cost of keeping him was her entire world, and she was now left with only him in the empty, echoing ruin of it. He had crept into her life like a cuckoo, pushing all other concerns from the nest. First, it was her friends whom he deemed a bad influence, then her family, who didn't understand their bond. Finally, the only other occupant left was her 2-year-old son, Liam. The child was the last competing fledgling, the final rival for her time, her attention, and her love. Mark systematically isolated him, framing the boy's every need as a deliberate act of aggression against their relationship. "He's only crying because he knows it irritates me," Mark would say. Or, "He's trying to come between us, can't you see that?" He painted the innocent toddler as a cunning adversary, a parasite draining the life from their love. The metaphor of the nest became her reality. Her life was the nest, and she was the mother bird. Mark was her sole focus, her true offspring. Liam was the interloper, the alien chick that did not belong, whose constant demanding chirps were starving her real bond. The day she did it, she saw herself not as a killer, but as a naturalist restoring order. She was removing the invasive species to ensure the survival of the rightful heir. It was an act of ecological balance in the twisted ecosystem of her life. When she pushed him beneath the water, she was simply pushing the usurper from the nest. There was a terrible logical purity to it, but nature is never so clean. The emptiness left in the nest was not a clean space for new growth. It was a grave. The silence was not peaceful. It was the sound of extinction. She had evicted the cuckoo, only to realize that the nest itself was now tainted, a crime scene. The act that was supposed to solidify her bond with Mark instead revealed the grotesque reality of their connection, a relationship that could only survive by consuming everything else in its path. She had cleared the nest, but she was now alone in it, with a predator. Her hands felt foreign to her, like clumsy tools attached to her wrists. They were the instruments, but the will that guided them was not her own. It was his. Mark's will was a palpable force in their home, a current that pulled her along, directing her actions, her thoughts, and finally her most horrific deed. He had never explicitly commanded, "Kill your son." He was too clever for that. Instead, he had planted the seed of an idea. Our life would be so much simpler without him, and then nurtured it with a constant drip of resentment and dissatisfaction. He crafted a reality in which the child was the source of all their problems, the single obstacle to their happiness. By the time she walked into the bathroom that night, the act felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. It was the next logical step in a script he had written. As her hands held the small, struggling body beneath the water, she felt a strange dissociation. She watched them as if from a distance, observing the mechanics of a murder she was not committing, but merely performing. They were his hands in that moment, carrying out his silent, desperate will. The strength in her fingers was his strength. The resolve that stilled the frantic splashing was his resolve. When it was over, and her hands lay limp and dripping at her sides, she felt no sense of personal guilt, only a profound, chilling emptiness. She had been the weapon, and he had been the hand that wielded her. She looked at him when she emerged, expecting to see the master reunited with his tool. But instead, she saw fear. He saw the weapon, now blooded, and realized it was forever unlocked. Her hands had done his will, but they were still attached to her. And in that moment, a new, terrifying thought was born in the void he had created within her. If her hands were capable of this at his bidding, what else might they be capable of? The instrument had been used, and now it had a history, a weight, a potential all its own. He had wanted a puppet, but he had created a monster, and he was now alone in a room with it. The process had been a slow, meticulous unmaking. The woman known as Liam's mother was systematically dismantled brick by brick until only a foundation of desperate need remained. It began with small surrenders. "Let me handle the discipline," Mark would say, his voice calm and reasonable. "You're too soft on him." Then it was, "He needs to learn to self-soothe. You're creating a needy child." Her instincts, to comfort, a skinned knee, to sing a lullaby, to answer a midnight cry, were pathologized, framed as weaknesses that were harming her son. He convinced her that her maternal love was, in fact, a form of smothering indulgence. Her confidence eroded, replaced by a constant, anxious second-guessing. Was she holding him too much? Was she not enough of a disciplinarian? The joyful, intuitive bond with her child became a source of stress and failure. Mark positioned himself as the expert, the rational counterbalance to her emotional parenting. He isolated her from other mothers who might validate her instincts, whispering that they were just competitive or judgmental. Over months, he hollowed out her identity, performing a psychological unmothering. The act in the bath, therefore, was not a violent explosion, but the final logical step in this long erosion. It was the ultimate act of tough love, the final correction to her perceived failures. As the water stilled, it was not a mother killing her son. It was the empty shell of a mother enacting the final lesson she had been taught, that the child was the problem, and his removal was the solution. The unmothering was now complete. She had been stripped of her core identity, and in the terrifying silence that followed, she was no one. She was not a monster, for even monsters have a purpose. She was simply a void, a negative space where a mother used to be, waiting for him to tell her who she was supposed to become next. There were no signed documents, no spoken vows. Their pact was sealed in the quiet of the bathroom, written not on paper but in water and silence. It was a mutual, unspoken understanding that had grown in the dark soil of their shared resentment for the life they were trapped in. He had his part, to cultivate the resentment, to paint the future in hues of golden freedom, to constantly remind her of the burden the child represented. Her part was to act, to be the strong one who could cut the tether holding them down. When she emerged, pale and shaking, her eyes met his and the pact was finalized. They were no longer just boyfriend and girlfriend. They were co-conspirators, bound by a secret more intimate than any declaration of love. This was a pact of blood. It was in the way they now had to craft a shared story, aligning every detail of their alibi with microscopic precision. It was in the way they attended the funeral, playing their parts of the grieving, unfortunate parents, their performance a silent, desperate dance only they knew the steps to. Every sympathetic touch from a relative, every tear they forced, was another stitch in the bloody shroud that bound them together. They were partners in a war against the truth, and their survival depended on absolute loyalty. This pact was stronger than marriage. It was a life sentence they had chosen to serve together. To betray the other was to betray themselves, to invoke a consequence far worse than prison, the utter annihilation of the new, monstrous world they had built from the ashes of the old one. They were each other's alibi, each other's witness, and each other's damnation. The love they once shared was now irrelevant, a faint ghost beside the solid, terrifying fact of their shared guilt. They were one, not in heart, but in crime. Their new life was a beautiful two-story house constructed entirely over a sinkhole. The foundation was the tragic accident. Every brick was laid with that story. The police report, the sympathetic news segment, the casseroles from neighbors. They moved through the rooms of their new existence, a life with more money, more freedom, more quiet, pretending not to feel the hollow emptiness beneath their feet. Their conversations were the careful furniture placed over the weak spots in the floor. "Remember that time we went to the beach?" he would say, and she would nod, both of them carefully editing the memory to crop out the small, smiling boy who had been there. Their entire shared history became a curated museum, with the central exhibit removed and all references to it scrubbed. The lie was the mortar holding their world together. It was in the way they could never truly relax, their ears always straining for the creak of a floorboard that might signal a collapse. It was in the way a stray toddler's sock found behind the dryer could send them into a silent, day-long panic. They had to constantly perform their grief for an audience of two, ensuring it was neither too shallow nor too deep, calibrating it to the story they had sold. They built a life on this lie, a life that looked perfect from the outside, a couple who had weathered a storm and emerged stronger. But inside, the structure was rotten. They could not have a real argument for fear of what truths might be unleashed in the heat of anger. They could not experience genuine joy, for it felt like a desecration. Their love, their home, their future. It was all a beautiful, elaborate facade built over a single, terrible truth. And every day they lived there. They knew they were just one honest moment away from the whole thing collapsing and burying them alive in the consequences. For 2 years, the child had been her tether. He was the anchor that held her to the world, to responsibility, to a fundamental sense of right and wrong. His needs dictated her schedule. His laughter filled her heart. His very existence gave her a purpose that was separate from the consuming vortex of her relationship with Mark. But Mark saw the tether not as a lifeline, but as a leash. He would watch her with the boy, his eyes dark with a jealousy so profound it seemed to suck the light from the room. "You love him more than me," he'd accuse, his voice a low threat. He worked tirelessly to fray the cord, to make her see her connection to her son as a burden, a limitation, a chain that kept her from the boundless, all-consuming passion he offered. He convinced her that true freedom lay not in the complex love of motherhood, but in the simple, brutal devotion of belonging only to him. The moment her hands pushed her son beneath the water's surface was the moment the tether snapped. It was not a feeling of release, but of catastrophic, weightless freefall. The anchor was gone. The purpose that had grounded her was severed. What she had mistaken for freedom was, in fact, a form of spiritual annihilation. She was now adrift in a vast, empty sea with Mark as her only point of reference. A dark star whose gravity was all that was left to pull her. She had cut herself loose from everything that was real and good, and now there was nothing to stop her from being pulled into the absolute darkness of his world. The snap echoed in the silence of her soul, a sound more final than any cry, and she knew, with a certainty that froze her blood, that she was now lost beyond all hope of return. She had once been a rose in full bloom. Vibrant, resilient, her love for her son a fragrance that defined her. Motherhood, for all its challenges, had been the sun and water that nurtured her. Then Mark arrived not as a gentle gardener, but as a blight. At first his attention felt like admiration, but it was the admiration of one who wishes to possess the flower, not to help it grow. Slowly he poisoned the soil. He blocked the sun with his demands and criticisms. He told her the rose was too wild, that its thorns were too sharp, that its very nature was inconvenient. He convinced her that the vibrant red of her love for her child was garish, and that she should aspire to be a quieter, more subdued bloom, one that existed solely for his private enjoyment. The life began to drain from her. Her vibrancy faded to a pale, weary echo. Her resilience crumbled into dependency. The murder of her son was not a sudden act of violence, but the final, wilting petal falling from a stem that had been systematically starved and poisoned. It was the inevitable conclusion of a long, slow death. As she stood over the tub, she was no longer a rose, but a dried, brittle husk, all color and life and scent extinguished. The act was simply the moment the last vestige of her natural self crumbled to dust. And in the aftermath, Mark looked at her, this wilted thing he had created, and she saw the flicker of disappointment in his eyes. He had wanted to own the flower, but he had never considered that the process of possession would destroy the very beauty he coveted. He was left holding a dead stem, and she was left as a ghost of her former self, a bitter, colorless memory of what she had once been. She had ceased to have a shadow of her own. Mark was the sole source of light in her world, and his presence was so overwhelming that it cast everything else into darkness, including her. Her opinions, her friendships, her joys, they were all swallowed by his shadow. and the largest, most defiant thing he had to eclipse was her son. The boy was a flickering candle of a separate life, a tiny, independent flame that stubbornly refused to be completely quenched by Mark's dominance. His needs, his laughter, his very existence created a small, warm pool of light that was hers alone. Mark could not tolerate this. He worked until the child too was absorbed into his shadow. He framed the boy's every demand as an attack, his every achievement as a triviality, his very presence as an obstruction to their grand romance. He made her see her son not as a person, but as the one thing standing between her and the total immersion into Mark's identity that she had been taught to crave. The killing then was the final act of vanishing into his shadow. It was the extinguishing of that last competing light. By destroying the one thing that was truly biologically hers, she was making the ultimate statement. I am nothing without you. I have no light, no life, no will that is not a reflection of yours. I am your shadow. When it was done, the assimilation was complete. There was no more resistance, no more separate identity. She was a silhouette, a flat, two-dimensional outline whose form was entirely determined by the man who stood in front of her. She had achieved the ultimate unity with him, but it was the unity of a prisoner with her cell. She was in his shadow, and now there was no other light left in the world by which she could ever see herself again. The silence they had coveted became a living entity, a third presence in the house that was far louder than the child's cries had ever been. It was not a peaceful quiet, but a heavy, judgmental stillness that pressed in on them from all sides. In the weeks that followed, their home became a museum of ghosts. A faint smudge of chocolate on the wall, a single tiny sock found under the radiator, the way the afternoon light fell in a certain square of the living room carpet where he used to play. Each was a landmine that detonated not with sound, but with memory. Mark tried to fill the void with the television, with music, with forced conversation about a future he still believed they could have. But every word he spoke was swallowed by the silence, leaving only its echo. Sarah would often catch him staring into space, his face a mask of something that was not quite grief, but a deep, unsettled agitation. He had gotten what he wanted, but the prize was poisoned. The freedom he had craved felt like a vast, empty plain, and he was now stranded in the middle of it with a woman whose eyes were dead. For Sarah, the echo was a constant internal scream. It was the sound of the water, the memory of the final, trusting look in her son's eyes before she did the unthinkable. She stopped speaking almost entirely, her voice having retreated to some deep, inaccessible part of her. She was a shell, and the only thing living inside her was the echo of her crime. They were two people bound together by a secret that was slowly eroding them from the inside out. Their relationship a ship taking on water in a calm, silent sea, doomed not by a storm, but by the sheer weight of the horror they carried. The end did not come from the police. It came from within, a final internal collapse. It was a Tuesday morning. The sun was shining. Mark was eating toast, complaining about a colleague. Sarah was staring at the empty high chair they had finally, guiltily taken to the curb. The mundane normalcy of the moment became suddenly unbearably obscene. The lie could no longer contain the truth. The foundation of their new life gave way all at once. Sarah stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. The sound was unnaturally loud in the silent room. Mark looked up, annoyed. "What is it now?" he asked, his voice tinged with the familiar exhaustion he now felt in her presence. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the space where the high chair had been. "I can't," she whispered. "You can't what?" he said, his tone hardening. "I can't live in this silence anymore." A flicker of fear crossed his face. "Sarah, don't start," we agreed. "We moved on." "You moved on," she said, her voice gaining a strange, hollow strength. "I just died here with him." She finally turned her gaze to him, and what he saw in her eyes made him recoil. It was not anger nor hatred. It was a final, absolute clarity. "I am going to the police," she said, her voice eerily calm. "I am going to tell them what I did." "What we did?" Panic seized him. He stood up, his fist clenched. "You can't. You'll destroy us." "You'll destroy everything." "There is nothing left to destroy, Mark," she said, looking around the empty, sterile kitchen. "It's already gone. This is the reckoning." She walked towards the door, not with haste, but with the slow, deliberate steps of someone walking to the gallows. It was not an escape, but a surrender. He didn't try to stop her. He stood frozen in the beautiful, quiet kitchen of their perfect, child-free home, and watched the life he had meticulously built, the life he had killed for, walk out the door to its inevitable end. The silence he had wanted so badly was now complete. And it was infinitely more terrible than he could have ever imagined. The reckoning had come, not with a bang, but with the soft click of the front door closing, leaving him alone with the ghost of his own monstrous creation.